Hello, everyone, and welcome to AimHi, the live, interactive, free online school. This AimHi Live is an extremely special one. We're welcoming a very inspiring guest. We started AimHi because we wanted to build a school powered by curiosity, where creativity is valued over conformity. Students learn to be better stewards of our planet, where barriers come down between areas of study, people, and nations, and where international unity, global oneness, are paramount to learning, where equality of opportunity unlocks the full potential of our societies, and where diverse thoughts and ideas flourish from all walks of life, and where the messages of our greatest role models span borders and cultures. This online school is built to welcome the likes of our next guest, whose entire life has been in pursuit of creating a better planet. He's nearly died multiple times working to uncover stories to protect people and nature. He's written countless astute and accessible books on subjects from globalization to climate. He's founded or co-founded numerous organizations for positive change, including the brilliant Rewilding Britain, Natural Climate Solutions, and many others. His short films have been watched many millions of times, including two must-watch pieces, including Nature Now with Greta Thunberg and Tom Mustill, and How Wolves Change Rivers, which is amazing. He's even a musician with an album out a few years ago, and he continues to write some of the most inspiring columns and articles available to read. I am really excited to welcome George Monbiot for everyone to meet. Do say hello, everyone.
Hi, Matthew. Hello, everyone.
We're going to be talking about a variety of things, including COVID-19, climate, nature as being central to education. Firstly, George, I know that you love etymology, and so I've prepared an etymology fact for you, and I was wondering if we could start with an etymology off, which I'm sure that you will win.
Yeah, etymology is the study of words and the root meanings of words. It doesn't mean that, the root meanings aren't necessarily the meanings that we use today, but it's often really instructive and interesting to see where words come from. So, but I would go for companion, which is a great word because it means with bread. So a companion is someone that you break bread with. And the idea of eating together is one of the most fundamental forms of fellowship. So hopefully when this pandemic's over, we can all start eating together again.
Okay, I'll give you mine. I'm not sure it's as good, but one of my favorites is sincere, because back in Roman times, if you had quite a cheap statue made, then it would have lots of chips in it and be quite imperfect, and they'd rub wax in it to try and smooth it out. So sincere is like sincere without wax. Did you know that one?
Yeah, lovely.
You already knew that one, didn't you? I knew you'd already know it. My first question to you is, you had a near-death experience in the jungles of Papua.
Yes.
Okay, right. I was thinking of the time that you got lost in the jungle.
So the only way of getting to the place we were trying to investigate down in the south of West Papua without getting caught by the soldiers and the police under this Hutu dictatorship, which was one of the most vicious, murderous dictatorships in human history, to try and find out what was happening to the indigenous people, what was happening to the forced migrants, these trans migrants which had been moved out there, often having been told they were going somewhere else. This horrible, horrible human rights catastrophe and environmental catastrophe. The only way we could get there was to walk from the central highlands down to the swamps in the south. And to begin with, that it was physically difficult, but it wasn't hard to find our way because we, myself and the photographer, Adrian Arvin, I was working with, took on a couple of local guides who were able to guide us up through the mountains, these incredibly steep and very remote, scarcely habited mountains. From the tops, at night you could see about 200 miles and you couldn't see a single light, not a single light anywhere. But then down the other side, going south, the trails very quickly disappeared, and we found ourselves in an area which hadn't been inhabited for about 50 years. There were different theories as to why it was completely empty, but there were no paths, no trails, nothing. There were sheer cliff faces that we had to find our way up and find our way down, and before long we got completely lost. So yes, you can guess that we ended up eating rats, snakes, stick insects. We got tropical ulcers caused by vitamin B deficiency, lost a couple of stone. I didn't have a lot of weight to lose at that time, but we came out, really properly famished when eventually we got out. In the course of it, we got swept away down a mountain river. We were constantly aware that we could get caught at any of the pinch points if we came down the rivers, caught by military checkpoints, and then we'd probably get killed. But eventually we got out. We came down into the swamps. We managed to rent a dugout canoe and then paddled for a few days until we got to a mission station, and then we were able to go overland till we got to this horrendous transmigration site where all the really bad stuff was kicking off, lots of people being killed on both sides.
But just asking George about a few more of the things that he's done. He's lived a life that is full of danger and risk in achieving some of the things that he's achieved, which is a lot more natural part of life than many of us are taught to believe. So it's always been a dream of mine to live in the Amazon. You spent 2 years there. Was it a peaceful time for you?
In trying to get to the heart of why so many people were moving to the Amazon, this was in the late 1980s, after I'd been working in West Papua. And the story was, these were just greedy people who were moving in. This is what everyone was saying. And it quickly became clear to me that actually a huge number of the migrants moving into the Amazon were being driven because they were having their land stolen from them elsewhere. And they were being driven off their land, often with torture, burning down of their houses, and had no choice but to move. And so what I set out to do was to follow them, was to start with the land theft, and then to follow people across the Amazon to where they were going. And the very first thing I got involved in was the land grabbing in the Brazilian state of Maranhão in the Nordeste of Brazil, which is actually slightly to the south of the Amazon, where huge numbers of people were being burnt out of their homes and murdered if they resisted. And their land was being grabbed by big businesses, by big ranchers, often backed by the full force of the state. The government, the judiciary, the police, the army, everyone was on their side against these peasant villages. And I had heard that there was stuff kicking off. I went straight there, traveled for a couple of days, and was really thrust right into the heart of a massive attempt by local people to resist the land grabbing that was taking place. The very first thing I saw was these people clustered into a friary covered in bruises and rope marks, scorch marks, having been tied up, beaten up by the pistoleros, the gunmen working for this big rancher. So I went back with them to their village, and before very long, I was completely immersed in the dispute myself, having fallen foul of the rancher and then of the military police. And it eventually ended up with me having to run for my life as they tried to get a bead on me, and was bundled out of the state overnight, and got back to Manaus, where I was living in the center of the Amazon. And it had a rather interesting and bizarre coda. I went back to the human rights organization in Manaus, who put me onto this story and told me this is where I needed to be. I went back to the brief. And as I walked into my friend's office there, he was on the phone, and he said to me, just sit down, I'm just talking to this person. And it turned out that on the phone was Jan Rocha from The Guardian, who was their correspondent there. This was years before I had anything to do with The Guardian. And she said, "Oh, I hear you've just come back from Maranhão." I said, "Yeah. It was all pretty hairy out there, but I've just come back from a land dispute." "Oh, well, you're just the person, because I'm investigating the story of this journalist who's been killed out there." I said, "Oh, no, that sounds terrible. What was happening?" She said, "Well, there was this British journalist working around Bacabal." I said, "That's amazing. That's just where I was working." And I said, "I'm amazed I didn't come across this person." "Yeah, he was found garroted behind the police station. The police murdered him." I said, "God, that's terrible." I said, so who was this person? Who was he working for? I've got the name here. It's George Monbiot, something, not quite sure. I said, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm afraid your story might not stand up. And it turned out that my death, unbeknown to me, had already been reported in several Brazilian newspapers. Quite what had happened, how that had happened, I don't know. But the fact that I was supposedly killed when I wasn't was what tilted that particular land dispute, and the ranchers were basically told to back off by the federal authorities. Didn't matter how many peasants were actually killed, how many of them were evicted from their homes, how many were tortured, how many were murdered in front of their families, irrelevant. One British journalist is not actually killed, and that is sufficient authorities to intervene. So it was a very interesting and depressing insight into how these things work.
I was just thinking about how your trip back to the Amazon became part of a BBC safety training video on how not to do journalism, right?
BBC had this radio series called Going Back, where where people would go back to places of considerable significance to them in the past. And they asked me, would I like to do one? And this was 7 years after a particular set of experiences. And I said, yeah, I'd like to go back to the state of Maranhão and see what's happened to the local people there and to the police who were responsible, who were basically the enforcers for the ranchers and had killed so many of them. Because supposedly, since I'd been there, there'd been this great democratization and liberalization and human rights and all the rest of it. I was a bit skeptical about how deep this had gone. So the first thing I did with the BBC producer I was with was to go to the police station where this man, this torturer and murderer, had worked, the sergeant at the police station, who was, the man most responsible for the killings. And they told me at the desk, no, he retired. He retired years ago. You'll never find him. We have no idea where he is. And so I said, well, can I have a look around the police station? As I came out of one of the cells in the police station, this cleaning woman grabbed my arm and she very quietly said, you're looking for Vidal? And I said, yeah. She said, if you find him, let me know. And I said, why? She said, because he's the father of one of my children and he's disappeared. And I said, well, how are we going to find him? She said, well, I've got a number for him, but I don't know where he is and he won't answer me. He won't talk to me when I phone. So she gave me the number. And so I went back to my hotel room with the producer. We spent hours. Well, first of all, he wasn't in the book. His name wasn't in the phone book. We went through the whole phone book, going down all the columns to find that number. And we eventually found it under someone else's name. So I rang the number and it was him. He answered. I recognized his voice immediately. And he said, who is this? I said, is that Vidal da Costa? He said, who wants to know? I said, it's all right. I know everything I want to know now, because beside it was his address. And so the following day, we went to the capital city of Maranhão, São Luís, and turned up outside his house. And it was getting some late afternoon then, and I knocked on the door. There was no reply. I went and eventually, when I knocked several times, this woman came to the door and said, he's out. And I said, I haven't even told you who I'm looking for. And she said, Vidal da Costa, he's out. So I went and sat on the other side of the road. I said, I'll wait for him. I sat on the other side. And a couple of people came up and said, who are you waiting for? I said, Vidal da Costa. Said, oh, he's in the house. We've seen him. He's in there. So I sat there and waited. And after a while, I saw this huge, bulky figure. It was an enormous, big bloke. I saw his silhouette behind the blind, just opening the blind and looking out. And so I went across the road and said, Vidal da Costa, I know you're in there. Come on out and talk to me about, and started naming all the people he'd murdered and all the people he'd tortured. Come and tell me about the murder of so-and-so. Come and tell me about so-and-so. Because I thought, he can't not come out if I'm there in the street shouting out about his crimes. And eventually the door flies open and he pulls out this revolver and he said, you've got 1 second to get out, and we just leg it round the corner. So anyway, this whole thing goes out on the radio, and for the next 10 years, the BBC used it in their health and safety training course as to what not to do when making a programme They never asked me to make another one after that. I don't think why.
Amazing. George, you seem like quite a superhero in many ways. Like you've survived cerebral malaria, and you've even survived prostate cancer. And I want to talk a little bit about COVID, but I also want to talk about your views on the NHS. Is there all my junior doctor friends are telling me how stressful the NHS is now. It was before COVID even began. What holds it together, and do you think that the NHS is as it should be? The NHS, for those watching internationally, that's the National Health Service of the UK.
Well, and the NHS is basically held together by goodwill. I mean, it's basically a community, and people go way beyond their contracts in working for it, spending far more time, putting far more effort into their jobs than their contracts demand, because if you don't, you're letting down your colleagues and you're letting down the patients, and it's very much seen by people working there as a collective effort, as you're part of a community that will be weakened if you don't put that extra effort in. But what successive governments have been trying to do have been to balkanize it, to split it up, to subject it to competition, to outsource as much as they can. And as a result, the community has started to fall apart. And those who are still trying to keep it going, and it sort of keeps going almost despite itself, have to put in more and more hours, work crazier and crazier extent to keep the whole system ticking over. And because of all the massive cuts that have taken place, there's a whole series of perversities within the organization. So, for instance, my brother-in-law is a surgeon, and he's a very specialist, very skilled surgeon who's probably had upwards of £1 million spent on his training. And yet, because they've sacked all the back office staff, he's now doing all this basic paperwork, which takes up about half of his time, which was previously be doing by temps in the back office. And so it's these total false economies. It's completely perverse. But this is what happens when the self-hating state wages war on its own institutions. And you've got a system of thought, which we call neoliberalism, which says that the private sector is always more efficient, to outsource, to offshore, to privatize, to marketize, than to allow a government institution to stand and be self-organized. And actually what we see again and again, and we've seen particularly with the NHS, is it's far, far less efficient to introduce competition and marketization and privatization than it is to allow the organization to work in a coherent and holistic way.
Many watching this will already have read a lot about this, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how the current situation with COVID relates to the current state of nature, and also looking at COVID itself. Some say that we could come out of this worse, some say we could come out of this better. I'm really interested to know what students think. Like, do type what you think in the chat as well. And what do you think, George?
Well, on the first question, I mean, clearly the pandemic and the environmental crisis do overlap. I mean, for a start, it looks as if COVID-19 came from the international wildlife trade, which has been a total catastrophe for wild species, for their abundance and diversity, as we've seen a lot of species pushed onto the red list, becoming endangered because of their trade, particularly into China. And so it seems to have passed from a bat to a pangolin to a human being, which are three species which would never otherwise have come into contact with each other. But of course, we see livestock farms also being a breeding ground for zoonotic diseases. We see them also reducing the effectiveness of antibiotics as they're used with such profligacy on some farms that bacteria are more likely to become resistant to those antibiotics, in which case they become useless for human medicine. So there's a whole series of interactions between systems which are catastrophic for nature and basically livestock farming and meat eating in general, for lots of different reasons, are catastrophic for nature, and things which turn out to be catastrophic for human health as well, of which this is just the latest iteration. Now, in terms of how we might come out of it, there is a great opportunity for a great reset, for switching the whole basis of the economy towards a regenerative circular economy, as opposed to one which just has to keep growing and growing while using ever more resources and producing ever more pollution. But unfortunately, it looks as if governments are determined not to take it. They just seem to want to get the old dirty economy back on the road, quite literally in some cases. For instance, the British government is now talking about a major road building program, just as huge numbers of people have found that actually they can work much better from home. None of it makes any sense. It's all about producing contracts for developers. Infrastructure planning is notorious for producing perverse outcomes because the lobbyists get in there at the beginning of the process and say, this is what we want. And then by the time the public gets a look in, the thing is already halfway to being built. At the moment, huge parts of the old economy are literally over a barrel, over several 100 million barrels of unsold oil in the case of the fossil fuel economy, and are totally dependent on government for their survival. So this is a fantastic opportunity for governments to say, right, if your company is going to survive, it's going to have to be completely repurposed. You're going to emerge from this no longer an oil company, no longer an airline company, no longer a car manufacturer. You're going to be doing something completely different. Instead of building oil rigs and gas platforms, you're going to be building platforms for wind turbines, for example. Similar technologies, why not do it? When the US entered the Second World War, within a matter of months, its civilian economy had been more or less completely repurposed into a military economy. Car manufacturers were turning out fighter jets. Domestic appliance manufacturers were turning out munitions. The whole thing turned round on a dime. And that was decades before digitization, decades before just-in-time production, all the ways in which things have sped up since. We could turn the whole economy round if we chose to, and the only thing missing is political will.
Camaflame just wants to say, how are you finding lockdown, George? And also, Ella has asked a question, which is, do you think that a positive environmental outcome of the pandemic is more selective broadcasting?
Thanks. Yeah, well, lockdown, yeah, I mean, look, by comparison to huge numbers of people, I'm doing all right. I work from home anyway. I'm self-isolating for 57 years. And what I'm struggling with is balancing work and schooling because my kids are at home and need to be taught. I'm basically working, teaching, and sleeping, and that's it at the moment. I'm a bit pissed off that the summer is slipping through my fingers because I'm very much an outdoor person, but so many people have it an awful lot worse than I do. I've still got a job, still working. I'm doing things which are meaningful, I think, which fill me with a sense of purpose. And that is a real privilege. It's a wonderful thing. Broadcasters and media in general, look, I mean, the model is fundamentally cropped. The great majority of the media is owned by billionaires. You have to be a billionaire to own it. And they use that to create a system of propaganda, a system which says that the world we want as billionaires is the world that you should want. What's good for us is good for you, whereas exactly the opposite pertains, because what they want is a world of extreme inequality in which there are such things as billionaires. They want a world in which they don't pay tax, so we don't have well-funded public services. They want a world in which money is not distributed. They want a world in which they're not regulated, they're not constrained by public protection, so they can treat the natural world as their dustbin, they can exploit the rest of us, they can destroy the prospects of future generations. They are our enemies, and yet they use their media empires to pretend to be our friends. And then you've got public sector broadcasters like the BBC, which were once, a long time ago, quite brave organizations which did a lot of investigative journalism, but are now being completely disciplined and tamed, and just represent the concerns of the mainstream and really shut out marginal voices. And as a result, they're always behind the curve. They are impervious to new thinking because the new thinking takes place at the margins. They're not hearing the voices of the people who are at the wrong end of the boot. What they constantly hear are the voices of the people who have power.
George and I met at the climate protests quite recently, and we were walking past these beautiful Dalmatian pelicans that I want to show you guys the picture of. These are in Regent's Park. I'm really interested to know, students, where do you guys think these pelicans are native to? Throw your thoughts into the chat, and I'm going to ask George to tell me the story that he told me as we were walking past them.
Well, as the name suggests, the Dalmatian pelican is now confined to a few pockets in Southeast Europe. But what I pointed out to Matthew as we walked past them is that this is a native bird to the UK. They used to live right across Europe, and their bones in the fossil record coming up into the Middle Ages. And the only reason they don't live here today is human persecution. They were eaten, marshes where they lived were drained, they were persecuted by various means until they became extinct here. They're quite prone to that because they're towards the top of the food chain, and animals towards the top of the food chain are far more ecologically vulnerable on the whole than those towards the bottom. And one of my ambitions is to bring them back. One, because they are magnificent, fantastic, amazing birds with a 10-foot wingspan, one of the heaviest flying birds on Earth. To see them flying out at sunrise to go fishing at sea and then flying back across the sunset to come home to their roosting grounds would be almost the pinnacle of my life if that was happening again in the UK. But also because if we had them living here again, it would show once more that we had healthy and thriving ecosystems. And the symbolism would be very powerful. And they're just one of a huge range of species that people are absolutely astonished to discover used to live here. If we go back to the previous interglacial period, the Eemian, which ended about 100,000 years ago, blink of an eye in ecological terms, it was a short interglacial in which there were no human beings living here. There was all the animals that we're used to today. There were robins and jackdaws and foxes and badgers and hedgehogs and lions and hyenas and hippos and rhinos and elephants. And we had a megafauna. Everywhere on Earth had a megafauna. And the megafauna is the default state of all ecosystems on land and at sea. And the only reason why only a few tiny pockets still have a megafauna is that we've wiped out those large animals everywhere else. So, we associate the tropics with being places where elephants and hippos and rhinos and lions and hyenas live. But actually, these are almost universal species. They live right across temperate zones and indeed into the far north. Even at the peak of glaciation in Britain, there were lions hunting reindeer across the frozen tundra.
One of my favorite stories is about how we only have the avocado because the giant sloth managed to last just about long enough to allow enough trees to be remaining by the time the Incas discover them. So the Committee on Climate Change just released their latest report, and it essentially says, in many ways, prepare for 4 degrees of warming, or prepare for a large amount of warming. Just to remind everyone of the words of Professor Jonas Rockström, who's one of the world experts on this, the current most likely trajectory would leave us in a world that would likely support only half of the current human population. Half. 50% gone. And indeed, the consequences of a 4 degrees C warmer world are so terrifying that most scientists would rather not contemplate them, let alone work out a survival strategy. George, it's impossible in a few words, but I'll ask the big question anyway. What is your current thinking about the state of our climate and ecology?
Well, I've been issuing warnings now for 35 years, which was when I started working in 1985 as an environmental journalist. And I've basically been saying the same thing. And throughout that time, I've been absolutely flabbergasted about how few other people are prepared to say it or even to listen to it. It's not so much the outright denial, which has been the issue, that there's been plenty of that. It's just people ignoring it, just not wanting to know, not wanting to hear it. And I've increasingly felt like the spectre at the feast, that unwelcome apparition who puts everyone off their food, and so you pretend he's not there. And what I found as a journalist was that I was progressively shut out of almost everywhere. I mean, I ended up at The Guardian because nowhere else would have me. I never wanted to work for The Guardian because I believed, rashly as it turned out, that you shouldn't preach to the converted. But it became impossible to work anywhere else because no other outlet wanted to hear it. I realized that the BBC had become completely hostile to the message when, with a producer friend, I'd spent several months working on what we thought was a really great proposal, really innovative, inventive, creative environmental series. And the controller of BBC Two at the time, a man called Michael Jackson, looked at the title when we brought it to him and said, "Is this environment?" And we said, yeah. He said, "I've been trying to get environment off this channel," and that was it. There was no point after that for the next 30 years in which I could get any traction at all with the BBC on these issues. It was a bit like saying, "Oh, people are bored of politics, let's not make any politics programs." We've had enough history, we've had enough economics, but the biggest issue of all, they decided they weren't going to cover. Or what they said was, well, we can do it in other programs, in current affairs. So if you were to ask me which industry has done the greatest harm to the living planet and its people, the oil industry or the media, without any hesitation, I would say the media. Because without the media being what it is, the oil industry would not have been able to function. If the media had done its job, that industry would have been shut down and fossil fuels would have been left in the ground and we would be okay. But it's because the media has not done its job that we're in the phenomenal mess that we're in today.
I think it's really easy to forget that most people in the world don't know yet that even with the incredible work that George and others are doing, that, well, because of the media not being as it should be, as George says, a lot of people don't realize that recycling isn't enough, that taking the bus isn't enough. And these are people who know there's a problem and still don't realize that is not enough. I'm seeing a question here from Alexa, who's saying, with the broadcasting press system as it is, how do we inform ourselves on these issues, and how do we come together collectively to move the thinking from the extremities to the mainstream?
On that latter question, I mean, there are pockets of resistance, and there always have been. There are outlets which cover things right, and I think The Guardian is one of them. I mean, it doesn't get everything right by any means, but there's a lot of good stuff on environmental issues. I mean, isn't it incredible we even call them environmental issues? They're issues about our survival. They're issues about everything, and yet we sort of box them off and we say, "Oh, look, there's this thing called environment, and it's out there somewhere, and it's alien to our lives." But just to me, it shows what a fix we're in. Anyway, The Guardian, there's Vox, there's Gris, there's Tree Hugger. I mean, there are lots of good outlets, lots of really small ones. I'm working with a group called Double Down News at the moment, who are producing some fantastic stuff. Lots of different people who just can't get their messages across in the mainstream media at all. But so there's lots of outlets doing great work, kind of filling these gaps, but they are on the whole at the margins. They're not The Guardian isn't marginal, but most of them have been sort of shoved to the edges, and it's just really hard still, even today, to get traction. And even today, these crucial messages are still marginal to the concerns of the great majority of journalists. So how do we bring these to the fore? I mean, we have to use social media to do that. It's still the case, to a ridiculous extent, that the social media agenda is dominated by the mainstream media. So much of what's discussed on social media, I mean, the serious stuff, is stuff which has been in the papers or been on the broadcasters. And, we're still not generating enough of our own content on social media. We're still not doing our own investigations. I mean, there's been some really good investigative outlets have been set up, like The Intercept, for example. It's fantastic work. But, set up with money from a billionaire. The problem persists. And so we need to get going with more self-organized stuff, more crowdfunding, more work sponsored through Patreon. And that's one of the reasons why I love Double Down News, is that they're entirely sponsored through their members on Patreon, through people donating. And that is the right model. I mean, that's why I'm working with them, because I think it's not just that they're doing good work, but this is a model on which media in general, the new media, should be built. And, we can get amazing proliferation through that. Some of the videos we make with Double Down News get millions and millions of hits. And, similarly with some of the other people I work with, Sustainable Human being an example. They're the ones who made How Wolves Change Rivers, and that's been watched like 40 billion times on YouTube. So it can be done, but it's going to be done at the margins. It's always going to be at the margins. Society is like an amoeba. It moves from the margins, not from the center.
Definitely encourage everyone to check out Double Down News. It's a really great source. I've focused quite a lot of my own work on soil and agriculture, and particularly beef, and it's quite a difficult area. I was at this conference, Financial Times Global Food Systems, and it was very kind of like, felt very kind of professional, and everyone just, talking in relatively quiet voices in a very polite way. But as soon as, I think it was Farhani Amin got on stage and was talking about beef, people from the National Farmers Union stood up in the middle of this conference and just started shouting at the stage at her. I'm from a farming family, and I kind of believe that we have to bring farmers along with us. I know that many see you as anti-farmer, especially after Apocalypse Cow, which is great, and everyone should watch that. What should we say to farmers, and how do we bring them along with us? And also, if any students at home are farmers, I'm interested to know your thoughts as well. So
the truth is, we're not going to bring all farmers with us. We're not going to bring livestock farmers with us. Basically, I'm saying we should see the end of livestock farming, and there are going to be very few livestock farmers who are going to say, yeah, I'll subscribe to that. That's not going to happen. And part of the danger, part of the problem is we're always trying to say, how can we work with industry to persuade industry to do things differently? And there's a whole load of industries which don't really fit into the idea of a world which is going to support our life support systems, which is going to sustain us. And unfortunately, the beef industry is one of those. Actually, I think the chicken and pork industries similarly, like the oil industry, like the aviation industry, they don't fit. They don't actually fit the model. And so what we need to be looking for is governments to repurpose subsidies to help people get out of those industries and to get other forms of employment, or put their land to different uses. And, what I would love to see is that land being used for rewilding, for instance, and for nature-based economies. And there's a huge amount of work showing how this can be done. And because almost all livestock farmers now are dependent on subsidies, certainly in Europe, there would be almost no livestock farming at all, apart from a bit of intensive pig and chicken farming in huge units. But there's certainly no outdoor livestock farming at all, and a lot of other stuff will go down without government money. So you say, right, well, let's use that government money then for other purposes. It's insane that we are paying billions every year to have our living systems destroyed, which livestock does, at a phenomenal rate. It's not just the greenhouse gas emissions, which are very considerable. It's the ecological opportunity costs, vast areas of land which would otherwise be devoted to nature, where there'd be thriving ecosystems, where we could have so many of our species which have become extinct in this country back, where we could draw down very large amounts of carbon by allowing the trees and other parts of the ecosystem to regenerate. That opportunity is denied by the fact that vast tracts of land are instead used for livestock grazing, which is incredibly destructive. Sheep, for instance, they selectively graze out tree seedlings, and they're a more powerful agent of deforestation than forestry has ever been in this country. 4 million hectares or more has been defoliated by sheep in this country. There's also the rivers. Now, livestock farming is the primary cause of river pollution in the rich nations. And in the UK, it's above all else dairy farming. Now, a very large proportion of our rivers have had most of their ecological systems wiped out by dairy farming and the slurry that goes into those rivers. Free-range chicken farming is next worst because the chickens lay down a scorching carpet of reactive phosphate across the land, and that gets washed off by rainstorms straight down into the river. The river eutrophicates, you get an explosion of algae, and indeed other microorganisms, and they suck the oxygen out of the water as they die. And so it's basically just a massive ecological disaster, and we're not going to solve it by talking nicely to the people who are doing it. It's the same with any other industry. You need structural change, and that structural change needs to be fair, it needs to be a just transition. But if we try to pretend that there doesn't need to be a transition, that we can just do it in a slightly different way and things will be okay, we're deceiving ourselves and we're deceiving everyone else, and we're not going to solve the problem.
I think that was such a good point about needing to help people instead of the industries. I'm also really glad that you touched on rewilding and natural climate solutions. I think those are two organizations that George either founded or co-founded that you should definitely look into supporting if you want to do something. Even spreading the word about these organizations is an excellent thing to do. Rewilding Britain and Natural Climate Solutions are two to look into. But yeah, further to the point about industries and us expecting them to just transform themselves, this is the thing that relating to nature has always really frustrated me, is that in nature, evolution comes from the upstart, change comes from the fringes, and it's these new animals that develop. You know, the dinosaurs didn't evolve into the mammals that we are now, and to expect the fossil fuel companies to transform us into a green future is insane. I only learned how the greenhouse effect properly worked after school, and I love science, and I'm wondering if all of our students fully get this. I was so confused about why the heat could come in but not get out. But anyway, at AimHi, we're working really hard to put nature at the core of the teaching that we're doing, and we're using it to bridge between different subjects in various different ways, like bacteria, writing poems, and CO2 levels compared to sleep cycles. And we see nature as a key stakeholder in the decision-making that we're doing. But George, you've said that including nature in teaching is a matter of life or death. Why?
I would say that the great majority of people in the world don't know how the greenhouse effect works. Well-educated people all the time who could not explain the carbon cycle or the water cycle or explain how soils form. These are absolutely fundamental to our existence, to our survival. If one of those people were to say, William Shakespeare, no, never heard of him. He was a playwright, was he? You would be absolutely horrified. You would be staggered to find that someone that had been through university had never heard of William Shakespeare. But to find that people can't explain the greenhouse effect or the carbon cycle or the soil formation or the water cycle, these absolutely fundamental issues to our survival, to me is just as shocking, and yet it's entirely commonplace. And because people don't understand these things, we can't pull them up as easily and quickly as we can pull up our knowledge that Shakespeare was a playwright, then we are extremely vulnerable to misinformation or to not grasping the importance of these subjects. And this is one of the many big problems with the media, that almost everybody in senior positions in the media is a humanities graduate, not a science graduate. There's a lot of talk about the lack of diversity in the media, quite right too, because it's very white, it's very middle class, or posh indeed, it's very male often. But how about the lack of diversity in specialisms? It's also very much tilted towards the humanities and away from science. And so, for instance, I've had BBC researchers phone me up in the days when I used to be asked to do interviews, and they would say, so this thing, you say that climate change is an issue. What's that all about? And I'd say, well, when we produce carbon dioxide, and say, hang on a minute, what's carbon dioxide? So literally, I've had that question. I've had to explain to someone how to calculate percentages. these really, really fundamental things, which would be the equivalent in the humanities, would be absolutely mortifying if somebody didn't know. It is the equivalent of not knowing who William Shakespeare was. And yet, these very often very posh, very well-educated, supposedly people, expensively educated, let's say, simply don't know the most basic aspects of maths and science. And this is miseducation. I'm not blaming the individual people for this, but there's something gone very seriously wrong with our education system and the emphasis we put on what's important and what's not to produce outcomes like that.
Two things that I feel like we should really have at the centre of our education in particular are community. We are constantly taught by our culture that to win is to dominate. And we look at nature and that's just simply not true. If any one species dominates, then it's at the cost of all of them. And also we understand extremely well that a monoculture field of corn is destroying the soil, and actually we need diversity for things to flourish. I know that you've started teaching your daughter ecology, and I've got a picture here which I'm going to show to everyone now of her with the painting that you guys have done. Could you tell us a bit about why you've taken this into your own hands?
So with my daughter and her best friend, I've been trying to put ecology at the centre of learning, because I think ecology is an incredible subject, and don't get me wrong, I'm not in any way against the humanities. I mean, I read vastly, I love going to the theatre, I love music, I'm crazy about all forms of learning. I just think we got the emphasis wrong. And I actually think that ecology leads us into so many other subjects. It's a way to get into maths, it's a way to get into wider biology, chemistry, physics. It's a way to get into literacy. It's a way to get into painting. And because ecology is literally at the center of our lives, at the center of our very existence, you can work outwards from it into almost anywhere. And so what we did in this particular case was I got my daughter and her best friend to paint 15 separate panels showing ecosystems all the way from the mountain tops to the bottom of the deepest sea. And going down into the soil. And in every case, we stuck on pictures of the species that live in those places, and could then start talking about the interactions between them, the interactions between them and the abiotic environment, in other words, the rocks and the rivers and the atmosphere and the rest of it. And we could talk about everything from trophic cascades to sedimentation, to the water cycle, to the carbon cycle, to decomposition, erosion. And then after that, we built ourselves a massive, great 3D landscape on a huge piece of cardboard. We created this lovely landscape going from sea level again to the mountaintop, and then we could look a lot more at some of the geological processes as well. And I mean, I can't pretend it's been easy. It's been a struggle, because getting the balance right between being a parent and being a teacher is something, we constantly have to navigate on both sides. The kids, they want their parents back, really. They don't want us to be teachers anymore. They want to get back to school. But I think, we've managed more effectively to hold their attention this way than by some of the conventional means of teaching that we could have used. And it has worked to an extent. There's been quite a lot of enthusiasm and there's been a lot of learning.
George, we are now starting to go into the final few minutes, and there have been a lot of questions asking about what can people do and how can people get into this. And I know that with soaring global temperatures, seas full of plastic and rapidly vanishing wildlife, I hope that all of our students will be hoping to get into careers where they can make a positive difference. How did you get into this? So I know that we talked about that a little bit, but I really want you to kind of tell us about, if someone wants to write about logging in Madagascar, then do they need to start at like a local newspaper writing about small affairs? And could you tell us about that and how that might relate to other jobs as well, and how people could work to try and create positive change?
I don't know if we can even talk about jobs these days, because unlike in my day, there's scarcely such a thing as a job anymore, certainly not one that you can walk into. Even in those days, you had to create your own role, really. The thing I wanted to do, which was to make investigative environmental programs for the BBC simply didn't exist. There was no such thing. And I hated university. I had a really crap time there. And so I really spent the last year and a half there, not involved in university life at all, but just putting myself in the position where I could get the job that I wanted by just getting experience and bombarding the only place I wanted to be, which was the BBC's Natural History Unit, with such an onslaught. Basically, I just said, look, you're missing something huge here. Here we are in the midst of environmental crisis. You're not covering it, and you're not investigating who the perpetrators of this crisis are. So they took me on with some misgiving. In fact, they tried not to take me on, and then they reversed the decision, and it went round about several times. But eventually, I got my foot in the door to make investigative environmental programs. And I said, look, I just promise you, you give me 6 months, you will not be sorry. And they won't, because we won a Sony Award, and we cracked some massive stories, some of which went global. And so I spent 2 years there thinking, this is it. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life. It's, I've landed on my feet. I just want to carry on making investigative environmental programs. And then by 1987, Mrs. Thatcher had got totally riled by the BBC because it had made these really good investigative programs, one called Maggie's Militant Tendency, showing how several of her cabinet members had been fascists in their youth, another one called Secret Society, showing how there'd been all this unauthorized spending by the government, hadn't gone through Parliament and stuff. And she launched a coup against the BBC, forced the Director General to resign, replaced him with an accountant, and my boss came in the next day and said, that's it, no more investigative programs. I said, well, what do you mean no? That's journalism. You can't have journalism without investigation. He said, I know that, you know that, but we've had it from the top. And that's it, the BBC never recovered. That was the point at which I left the BBC. It was pointless, totally pointless staying there after that. And it's never recovered. It's been a timid, disciplined organisation ever since, which has not been doing its job.
I think that if you want to get into a role where you want to change things for the better, then you have to be quite imaginative nowadays. And I think it's really important for us to be imaginative if we're going to change things for the better. I mean, no positive change ever happened in the world by doing things the way that they've always been done, and it takes creativity to invent, courage to stand by what's right, and perseverance to bring about progress.
So, well, perseverance is the most important bit. You've just got to stick at it, and you'll be rebuffed 100 times before you get the break. You've just got to keep sticking in there. It's resilience, it's perseverance. Those are the two things that will get you through more than anything else, more than skill, more than talent, more than experience. Resilience, perseverance, just stick with it. And eventually you'll find a way through. Do not give up.
Thank you so much, George. I think that now we're probably quite run out of time. So I just want to start to wrap up and say to everyone, if you're not trying to change the world for the better, then you're living in the wrong time. So just before we finish, just a few quick notices. So for those who are joining for the first time, thanks so much for coming on. This is a poster for the summer school that we've got coming up, including the big catch-up, which we'll do in the last 2 weeks of August, the learning adventures that we will do across the summer, many of which will have climate and nature as absolutely central to them, and even the chance to become an author as part of the poetry project, which is going to be, again, based around climate and nature, being run by Phil. So do please come along to that too. And if you haven't already, do please follow our socials, which you can see over here. They're all at AimHi Live, and spread the word about what we are trying to do here. Oh, and also do give us feedback if you'd like to, and you can do that just below the live lesson so that we can continue to improve what we're doing. Also, one quick notice about Tom Mustill, who's a friend of ours. He's just started a podcast called So Hot Right Now, which is featuring amazing people like David Attenborough and Christiana Figueres, and he's got Ellie Goulding on the episode this week, and I promised him that I would tell you all about it, and you should all check it out. It's called So Hot Right Now. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, George, for taking the time for us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Matthew. Lovely to talk to you all. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you all. We will be back next week. Farewell.